into the spider's den, trapped in the shadows. Some of you might already know what urban exploration is. Urbex is basically the idea of breaking into abandoned buildings, facilities, warehouses, and so on to either get a good scare or just to feel that rush of adrenaline. Since this stuff is pretty illegal, us explorers tend to do it at night. However, I'm no ordinary adventurer. I'm an artist, a graffiti artist for about 10 years now, but recent events might change that. I've practically combed every square inch of my city. I live for this kind of thing. Countless nights fueled by smokes, empty beer cans, and amphetamines. I'm what lurks in the night while the rest of you are sound asleep in your warm, comfy beds. But don't worry, I'm usually not interested in your wallet or your home, as long as you don't call the cops and mind your own business. Alright, enough mucking around. This particular spot caught my eye when I was wasting my boss's time and money scoping out new spray spots on Google Earth. A fascinating tool, by the way. It takes some of the mystery out of it, but it sure saves time when searching for these places manually. According to the coordinates and the directions I got, it was about a 5-hour drive north of the city. Not a big deal, though I only had a couple of paid vacation days left and didn't want to wait another 4 days to take my trip. So I called in sick and prepped for the drive to head off early the next morning. The morning came, and I've never been so excited in my life to go on a road trip. I loaded up the spray cans in the boot of my car and swung by my local dealer to grab a bit of gear. Then I was off on my long journey. After endless kilometers of winding roads through the mountain pass, I came across a road that seemed to be the right way according to my GPS. You can only get so far by car though, so I had to improvise for the rest. I turned off the pass and stopped at one of those yellow security gates, meant to stop cars from going further down the road. Thankfully, I had a bolt cutter handy. I cut the chain, swung the gate open, and drove through, making sure to close it behind me to avoid unwanted attention. I drove up the steep gravel road into the forest, feeling like I was driving for ages. The road was getting rougher, but I managed to find a spot to pull over and park my car safely. Clearly, this road was only meant for 4-wheel drives, but I had no clue what I was really getting into. By now, it was about 4 p.m., and the sun was setting behind the trees, towering over me. I could see my breath in the cool autumn air as I hiked the rest of the way. As I climbed higher up the hill, it felt like the trees were watching me, almost leaning in, like I was a rat in a maze. I brushed it off as paranoia from the substances I'd consumed. I finally reached the place, greeted by a chain-link fence with barbed wire curled over the top. I cut a hole big enough for me to slip through unnoticed and crossed the clearing leading up to the facility. 2 silos loomed above, towering over the massive industrial building next to them, all rusted and painted a dark burgundy, like dried blood. My heart raced as I got closer. This place was enormous. As I approached a metal door, I fished a ciggy out of my pocket, took a drag, and inspected the door. It was already kicked in. My first thought was squatters, something I'm always ready for. But this was weird. Why would people trek all the way out here? The nearest bit of civilization was at least a 2-hour drive away. Then I thought maybe it had already been looted, which would be a real letdown. It's always more satisfying being the first person to explore a place that's probably been abandoned longer than I've been alive. I double-checked to make sure I had my Stanley knife and my switchblade, and then stepped through the busted door. The smell of damp, rusted metal and mold hit me as I ventured further in. The tall, windowless walls blocked out any natural light. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my headlamp, and flicked it on to get a better look. Turns out, I was partially right. Graffiti covered the walls of the dark corridor, scribbled nonsense with industrial marker pens. I passed a few doors leading into an office, a bathroom, and a break room. Then I reached another steel fire door with a push-bar lock. I pulled on the mechanism, opening the door, and a wave of rotten air hit me. I gagged, nearly spewing as the rancid smell, like a decomposing body burning beside an old tire, filled my throat. I pushed on, though, and eventually got used to the stench. Warm air brushed against my bare skin as I crossed the threshold, almost like someone had cranked up an industrial heater, though obviously, that wasn't the case since the building wasn't powered. I found it pretty odd. considering it was mid-November and I'd just been freezing my arse off. I don't know why that didn't set off alarm bells back then. To be honest, I think I was trying to rationalize the significant temperature change. But I digress. In the middle of the room stood a massive cylindrical industrial pump attached to all sorts of worn-out, shredded hoses that ran off in different directions, probably functioning as some sort of irrigation system for the surrounding rooms. Around the pump was a conveyor belt leading to a small hole that opened into the room before me. The whole setup was fascinating, and I thought to myself, I've got to leave my mark on this. So I climbed up the pump structure, reaching out with a spray can to tag the best spot. After scaling the top of the giant machine, I peered down into the pump. My torchlight revealed an empty reservoir, except for what appeared to be a remnant of thick, tar-like liquid at the bottom. What struck me as odd was that it seemed to be moving, almost like it was alive. I shook off the thought and continued marking my tag on the outside of the pump. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling, so I decided to satisfy my curiosity and explore the rest of the factory. I started by following the conveyor belt, which stretched through both the northern and southern parts of the room. I chose to head south first, since I had come from the northwest corner. Walking along the wall where the conveyor belt ran, I found a door and stepped through. Again, that burnt hazelnut smell overwhelmed me, and sweat dripped down my face as the temperature climbed far past my comfort zone. The first thing I noticed was the source of the heat, and possibly the smell, a furnace. A glowing red stream pulsed behind the grated door of the large industrial incinerator. Now I was on edge. There was no reason for this thing to be active, let alone burning something. Whatever it was, someone was trying to get rid of it. What confused me even more was the level of security around the furnace. It was surrounded by an iron cage that extended all the way to the ceiling. I honestly didn't know what to make of it. Unease turned into fear, and fear quickly morphed into panic. I decided it was time to get the hell out of there. I grabbed the door I had just come through, but it wouldn't budge. In a frenzy, I yanked at the steel handle repeatedly, but my attempts were futile. Stepping back, I noticed the hole in the wall where the conveyor belt entered the previous room. It was my only way out. The room felt like it was getting even hotter as my pounding heart sent blood rushing through my body. It was quickly turning into a nightmare. I scrambled toward the hole in the wall, dropping to my stomach and stretching my arms through it. As my upper body made it to the other side, I heard the steady grinding of gears. A loud hum, followed by the ignition of what looked like a generator, echoed through the room. I felt electricity surge through the conveyor belt as it slowly kicked into motion, dragging me back towards the incinerator. Adrenaline and pure survival instinct shot through me as I wriggled as fast as I could, desperate to avoid my impending doom. It was a tight squeeze, trying to get the body of a fully grown man through a hole barely 70 centimeters wide. What made it even harder was the fact that the conveyor belt was slick with the same black, gooey muck from the pump reservoir. Luckily, I managed to roll onto the hard concrete floor and gasp for air, but there was no time to rest. I needed to get out of there, fast. I rushed back to the northwest corner of the room where I had entered, but froze in shock, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The door, it was gone. The hairs on my neck stood up as blood rushed to my head. I sprinted to the opposite corner, but it was useless. I began circling the room, frantically searching for an exit. Finally, I found a door I hadn't noticed before and rammed into it with enough force to knock over an NFL linebacker. It probably would have opened with half that effort, but I wasn't taking any chances. Before stepping through, I turned around and saw that not only was the room now fully lit by the fluorescent lights, but the giant industrial pump had switched on. The conveyor belt was running, and everything was operational. The door slammed shut behind me, and I found myself in another long corridor. My heart was now thumping so hard in my chest, it felt like it would never slow down. This hallway wasn't as dark as the last. Something had powered up the entire building. It creaked and groaned as the hum of industrial lighting buzzed above me like a swarm of flies. Red scribbles covered every inch of the walls beside me in an endless pattern, with each symbol perfectly mirroring the next in a sequence of unreadable text. I followed the long corridor, scanning for a green exit sign, until I reached a door that stuck out like a sore thumb. It was a wooden door with a gold handle in pristine condition. Carefully, I turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was covered in the same writing, even the ceiling was completely filled with it. The detail was immaculate, and I couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. There were no furnishings, but directly across from me, embedded in the wall, was some kind of alcove, glowing like a centerpiece. The room felt almost soundproof. It was so silent, I could hear my blood pulsing through every vein in my body. The alcove in the wall before me seemed to be breathing. There was a closed eye etched into the center of the alcove. My legs carried me closer as my eyes stayed locked on the simple yet compelling design. Soon, I was within reach. My hand extended, feeling the warmth radiating from the alcove. The eye in the center snapped open, and a blinding flash erupted. Pain shot through my entire body, burning like I'd been thrown into a fire. In the same moment, my vision returned, and I hadn't moved, but the alcove was gone, replaced by the smooth, dark brown surface of wooden paneling. My body turned, and it felt as if I was in a completely different space. The room seemed familiar, but there was no writing on the walls. Everything looked brand new, like I'd been thrown back in time to when the place was still operational. The loud machinery pounded through the wooden door in front of me as I made my way back across the room. As I approached the door, I pressed my ear against it before turning the handle. Once again, fear gripped my body. The growl of something eerie passed by me just as I was about to open the door. This nightmare I seemed to have stumbled into was getting worse by the second. For a moment I started sobbing, as all hope felt lost. But I'm stubborn. There was no explanation my mind could come up with that would ease my anguish. The only thing I could do was survive. The sounds eventually died down, and I yanked the door open to peer into the hallway. Once again, the writing had been replaced with polished metal, wood paneling, and smooth concrete floors. I waited for a moment, then slipped out the door and walked in the opposite direction from where I had come. The pipes above me promised that they had to lead somewhere out of this place, but I had no clear sense of direction, so I just followed the only lead over my head. As I walked down the hall, I kept my wits about me. The last thing I wanted was an unexpected encounter with the creatures that inhabited this facility. I just wanted to slip out unnoticed and get as far away from here as possible. After a few twists and turns, the pipes led me to a huge set of double doors. I carefully pushed through, and my eyes widened at the gruesome sight in front of me. Bodies were strung up as high as the building allowed, and at the top hung a sort of enormous chandelier. Countless corpses dangled, covering every inch of the hanging object, making it look like a cocoon of human remains. Each one was hanging upside down, their necks slit wide open, so all their blood drained into a giant funnel beneath them. The funnel was attached to the pipes that ran above me and back into the previous room. If I hadn't been high on speed, I might have passed out on the spot. I wandered around, inspecting the macabre display, when suddenly, I heard the creak of the door I had entered through. Quicker than a leopard on crack, I dove behind a stack of crates on the far side of the room, hiding myself. Huge, hairy hands appeared, pulling down the bodies that had finished draining their last drop of blood and replacing them with fresh ones. I cringed and looked away before I could catch a glimpse of the creature, but I heard the sound of tearing flesh followed by the heavy flow of liquid making its way through the pipes of the collection machine. That same eerie growl and gurgling sound I'd heard before echoed from the creature as I noticed the doors behind it closing. One thing I'm grateful for is that I never caught a proper look at whatever the hell was responsible for these horrific crimes. If I had, I'd probably have died from a heart attack on the spot. Once I knew the coast was clear, I left the room through a door on the opposite side. Blindly, I sprinted down the next corridor and down an incredibly large set of stairs. It started getting warmer, not just hot but humid, like a small bathroom after a long, steamy shower. Sweat poured from every pore as I ran into the darkness. Soon, I was completely surrounded by shadow. I slowed my pace, reaching for my headlamp just as I ran straight into a massive web-like thread. The web was thick and heavy, nothing like what you'd expect from spiders in the area. I scratched and tore at the strong fibers that clung to my body. It felt like I'd been caught in a fishing net. My headlamp flickered on the bundle of webbing that now lay on the ground. It glistened in the light, ivory in color, and stretched across the 5-meter-wide dirty tunnel I now found myself in. As I neared the end of the tunnel, the dull, familiar thumping of an industrial pump above me rained dirt particles and pebbles down on me. Barely 20 meters ahead, I came across a gaping hole, and what I saw filled me with a terror so profound that words can hardly describe it. The hole opened up into a massive cave beneath the factory. Everywhere, these huge webs, thick as ropes, were draped between stalactites and wound around sharp limestone structures hanging like icicles from the ceiling. The ground was surrounded by egg sacs, stacked high above my head like boulders. Green pus oozed from small openings like infected wounds on rotting flesh. In the middle of the cave was a gigantic spider-like creature, almost taking up the entire space. Its long legs were curled under its body, and its head hung low to the ground. Tubes protruded from its mouth, leading upwards into a shaft. Snow-white fur covered its entire body and head, blending almost seamlessly with the thick, silky webs surrounding it as it slumbered. My skin must have turned as pale as the spider's fur as I stood there, paralyzed with fear. I was inside the lair of something so eerie and otherworldly that my brain could hardly comprehend what my eyes were seeing. Then I heard something. Faint, muffled cries from the far corner of the cave. I crept towards the sound, careful not to wake the slumbering beast. The desperate noises grew louder and more frantic as I approached a set of green eyes peeking out from the webs. My heart nearly leapt out of my throat as I tugged at the webs wrapped tightly around the figure. The spider stirred a little in its sleep as I ripped at the thick, silken bindings. I managed to free the webs from the captive's face and was shocked to see it was a young girl. "Help, help me," she croaked weakly. The giant spider shifted again, and I held a finger to my lips to signal her to be quiet. I pulled out my switchblade and she flinched slightly in fear, but I carefully cut through the webbing. Soon enough, she was free. Tears streamed down her face as she threw her arms around my neck, squeezing me so tightly I almost choked. She was almost naked. The only clothing she wore was tattered rags covering the sensitive area below her waist. I noticed a trickle of dried blood seeping from beneath her clothes. The moment I freed her, the spider's eyes snapped open. Its long, furry legs stretched outwards while its body remained on the cave floor. An ear-splitting screech erupted from its maw as it spat out the blood it had been receiving through the tubes. The spider's legs pounded the ground repeatedly with such force that the entire cave shook. Stalactites fell from the ceiling, impaling one of the large egg sacs beneath them. Hundreds of fist-sized spiders poured out of the opening. The girl, still clinging to me, went limp, almost pulling me to the ground as the black ocean of hatchlings swarmed. I hoisted her unconscious body over my shoulder and bolted for the cave entrance. A massive leg slammed down beside me, nearly knocking us over. With one last leap through the cave's opening, another leg slammed into the wall above us, causing debris to fall and block the entrance behind us. Just as I narrowly escaped our impending doom, I picked myself up from the now blood-soaked ground. The blood was about a centimeter thick and rising. I grabbed the girl and sprinted for the stairs, through the collection room and down the hallway, back to the room I had originally come from. I burst through the door. As I set her down and turned to shut the door behind me, a massive appendage with a large, human-like hand wedged through the door as I tried to close it. I couldn't match the raw strength of the creature as it forced its head through the opening. Its face resembled a human's, but its head had 8 glowing red eyes. Huge fangs protruded from its maw as it growled, and white, sticky slime oozed from its gaping mouth. I leaned against the door, grabbed my switchblade, and stabbed it straight in the eye. It shrieked and pulled back through the opening, allowing me to slam the door shut and slide the lock into place. At that point, I was running on pure instinct. I had no idea why I had retreated into this room, but if I'd gone any further, that thing could have ended us both. As I looked around the room for a way out, an idea popped into my head. The alcove itself was just drawn on the wall, and since it was missing its inscription in this dimension, why couldn't I just recreate it? The door behind me started banging repeatedly. I could hear the wood splintering, like the hinges were about to give way. I pulled a can of white spray paint from my pocket and ran to the spot where I had touched the alcove. Thanks to my creative memory, I managed to replicate the design I had seen before. It was a long shot, but it was the only option I had left. The only other way out of here was straight into the lair of death. I grabbed the girl, walked over to my drawing, and placed my hand on the open eye I had painted in the center. At that moment, the door burst open, and several of those humanoid spider things flooded in, followed by those disgusting hatchlings from the cave. They swarmed the walls, swirling in small, menacing circles as more and more of them filled the room. I closed my eyes and prayed to any god that would listen to get me out of here, as I felt something land on my shoulder. In the same second, my hand became burning hot, and the heat spread through my entire body. Everything around me seemed frozen. The only sound I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my chest. As I slowly opened my eyes, I didn't even notice the spider on my shoulder until it hissed in my ear. But with one motion, I flung it to the ground and stomped on it hard enough to squash the little thing beneath the weight of my boot. At that moment, I realized I was back in the room I had come from. I let out a deep sigh of relief and readjusted the girl on my shoulder as she was slowly slipping down. I didn't even bother to look around. I just walked back into the room with the pump, and sure enough, the entrance door was back in place. A wave of relief washed over me as I stepped through the door and into the cold night air. I left the property, squeezed us both through the fence, and stopped to set the girl down at the foot of a tree. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath, traumatized by the horrors I had just survived. I took off my mud-soaked jacket and wrapped it around the girl, who came to not long after. "You all right?" I asked quietly as she slowly opened her eyes. Her first expression was fear, but when she realized where we were, it shifted to relief. "It hurts," she groaned, clutching her arms around her lower abdomen. "I know. We need to keep moving. Can you walk?" She nodded and slowly got to her feet. The girl was barefoot, so I let her lean on my arm as we slowly made our way back to my car. By now, the sun had risen, casting an orange glow through the trees. We made the entire trek back in complete silence. I had so many questions, but I figured they could wait until we both felt better. We reached my car, and I helped her into the passenger seat. After starting the engine and heading back towards town, I finally broke the silence. "How the hell did you end up there?" I asked. She nodded, shrugged, still pressing her hands to her stomach. "Are you hurt? What happened? Why didn't they just eat you like the others?" I nudged her, not giving her enough time to answer. She only groaned and pressed her stomach harder as she leaned her head against the window. Reluctantly, I stopped pressing for answers, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. The entire ride, she groaned, writhing in pain, never once mentioning what had happened to her. I wasn't sure if it was because of the shock or if she just didn't have the strength to talk about it. As we approached the city, her groaning turned into full-on screaming. Her nails dug into her abdomen so hard that blood started to trickle out where she had broken the skin. I had already planned on taking her to the hospital, but now I was terrified. I wasn't sure if it was the amphetamines I had been popping all day or the fact that this girl was screaming her lungs out right next to me. Either way, I floored it and raced towards the emergency room.